Good afternoon, and welcome to our Friday Devotional, which is based on the Revised Common Lectionary Readings. And this will be the 10th Sunday after Pentecost, and we've been working on Year A, and we've been looking at the Gospel readings. And today we find ourselves in Matthew, one of those familiar stories, as you can probably see what that's all about already. This is the story of Jesus walking on the water and Peter coming out to meet him in the middle of a storm. And there's always, this is always a kind of interesting story because there's so many different ways that we can look at that. But this comes right after last week's lesson, which was on the feeding of the 5,000. So we have the killing of John the Baptist, we have the feeding of the 5,000, and then we have this. So kind of put it in context of where this fits into Jesus' life. And we find that story in Matthew 14:22 through the end of the chapter. And here's how it goes. Immediately after this, after the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up to the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there, alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble, far away from land, for a strong wind had risen and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost." But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage. I am here." And something that Peter must have noticed right away is that it was the Lord in this process. So now Peter says, then Peter called out to him, "Lord, if it's really you, it sounds like your voice and it looks like you, but Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." And Jesus says, "By all means, yes, come." And so he does. So Peter went over the side of the boat. Remember, it's storming out. The disciples had been rowing against the wind. And so Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. So he had a successful couple steps, at least. Maybe 5 or 6 or 7 steps. We don't know. Maybe he walked for 10, 12, 20 feet. And at some point he noticed he was away from the boat and he was walking on the water. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind, the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. And Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed to him. "You have so little faith," Jesus says. "Why did you doubt me?" When they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped, and then the disciples really worshipped him. "You really are the Son of God," they exclaimed. And after they crossed the lake, they landed at Gennesaret. And when the people recognized Jesus, the news of his arrival spread quickly throughout the whole area, and soon people were bringing all their sick to be healed, which is exactly what they were doing during the feeding of the 5,000. They were bringing sick to be healed to Jesus. And they begged him to let the sick touch at least the fringe of his robe, and all who touched him were healed. Lots of good stuff in this little section, 11 verses about Jesus and his ministry. And, so often Peter gets a bad rap for sinking into the waves, and Jesus rebukes Peter for, "Why did you have so little faith?" But all the other disciples just kind of stayed in the boat. They didn't. I love that story. That the first time I ever heard this perspective was on the DeGarmo and Key double live album called "No Turning Back," and Dana Key at the end of the concert talks about Peter was the only one willing to get out of the boat. The other disciples all stayed in the boat, but Peter was impetuous. And you gotta love Peter, that he's impetuous about this kind of stuff. And he's the one who claims that Jesus is the Messiah, and here he is, Lord, if it's you, let me step out. That's my prayer. Peter stepped out of the safety of the boat, and we are in very unusual times, and sometimes we want to do the comfortable thing. We want to do the safe thing. We want to do that kind of stuff, and here Peter jumped out of the boat without thinking at first, and it wasn't until he was out in the water a ways that he realized that, oh, wow, I'm walking on the no, I'm away from the boat. Fortunately, Jesus was right there with him. But Jesus saved him. He says, why have you a little faith? You had already, and there's the other thing. Sometimes we get out and then we question ourselves when we get out a little ways. And we need to continue to go as God called us to go. And I love this, just as they were doing before the feeding of the 5,000. So just imagine how this went. Healing the sick during the feeding of the 5,000. Then they come to the other side of the lake, and everybody's gathered here, and Jesus starts healing. And this is one of those little known things. We know about the woman who was healed by touching the fringe of Jesus' garment, but here multiple people were just, all they were doing was reaching out and touching his garment, and they were healed. And so the question is what is God, how could you be more like Peter today? Yeah, we all see the waves, we all see the wind, but Peter stepped out. Jesus said, come, and Peter was obedient. And we've been working on the book of James in church, and we say, have faith. But James says we have to do more than just be hearers of the word. We need to be doers of the word. We need to be obedient. If we are not obedient to God's word, if we're not obedient to what he's calling us to do. So be like Peter. Be like Peter, even though, it might not always work out. And sometimes because our faith is weak, sometimes it just doesn't work out. But be like Peter and step out in faith and walk on the proverbial waters. Have a great day. Have a great week. Blessing.